this year's visiting scholar in conservative thought policy, Professor Alan Kahn.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's my privilege and pleasure tonight to introduce Professor Deirdre McCloskey, who has had a distinguished career combating widely accepted mistakes in many fields. And despite this daring attitude, after teaching for many years at the University of Chicago, at the University of Iowa, and the University of Illinois at Chicago, she's nevertheless still invited to lecture all over the world and to be a visiting professor at many different institutions. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of numerous honorary degrees. In many respects, she is unique in the breadth of her teaching and scholarship. She's the only person I've ever encountered who has held tenured positions in English and history and economics. And 2 of those are possible, but 3 is really unusual. And she holds the unique distinction of having at one point been the occupant of 5 different offices on the same university campus. One of her most recent books, out of, as you can see, a very short list of her works on the board, which is not complete, by the way, but one of her recent books, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Ideal Enriched the World, will soon be the subject of a Benson Center podcast, which I encourage you all to listen to, a discussion between Professor McCloskey and Professor Shiloh Brooks of the Benson Center. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Professor McCloskey.
Thank you so much, dear. I forgot to put that book on my list. I'm ashamed of myself. I have a speech defect, so you can either grow accustomed to my stutter. I stutter in the word stutter, so I have to go with speech. Screaming from the room. Philosopher at the Institute for Advanced Study, Michael Walzer, was once asked to contribute to a book not approve of corrupt people. Corrupts people. And so does every other political and economic. Easily absorbed is that we're fallen creatures. And socialism, democratic socialism, undemocratic socialism, conservatism, theocracy, whatever. Served in the United States Army knows that. Institutions aren't assurances of virtue. That's the key point. Institutions don't force us to be good. Life, friend, have all the institutional guards in place, and yet still face, as we faced in the United States for years, a threat from an unprecedented politician. Although you might take views, some people do, it doesn't know that all politicians are unprincipled, in which case we have a much longer history. But the threats that are only avoided by goodness. As may, he said, if people were angels, there would be no need for government. I think it's equally true that no protects us from devils. Right? So there's a need in political and economic philosophy for a serious consideration of ethics, dual ethics, and what might result in the combination of institutions and ethics in social and political. Now, this trilogy of mine, the first three, defending capitalism, and I should stop using the word capitalism because I think it's a scientific error compressed into a word. It says the very word, and many people think this way. Many economists do, and many critics of the system, enthusiasts, and Forbes, Capitalist Tool, and so forth, think that capitalism, the system we have, must be about capital. Must be about investment and accumulation. And that it's accumulation that makes rich. I think that's right. These last two of the trilogies and the popular book that was co-authored with Art Carden says that, sorry, what's wrong? Aren't you hearing
We're
me?
getting bad audio for the live stream, so if you could put that on.
We should have done this before. Okay, I'll hold it. Yeah. That for the word innovism, which is a much more accurate description of the economic, so to speak, its ideology, which is improvement. Economic, something is worth doing, it succeeds, purchased by consumers, and it's decided in some collective way to be a good thing, and we do it. That's not capital accumulation necessarily, although it often involves capital accumulation, but it also involves the existence of the universe and the existence of the labor force and the era of time. There are an infinite number of necessary conditions for the enrichment of the modern world, such as we see around us. And accumulation of capital is one of them, but it's not the initiating. Presented to you is what we sometimes call an executive summary of my history. Complete. Other things to say about economic history, but that's my view of what happened to centuries, to the virtues of people operating in innovism. What does anybody get closer to this microphone with the successes, failures,
Even if I move the chair, she can sit down. She can sit right there.
And the successes, failures, virtues, and vices of the economy. I would argue that innovism is if it's okay if I sit on this, shall I sit there instead of?
That would be better because it's closer to the microphone. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Okay, I'll sit here. Can you hear me? Are you hearing me?
You just need to get closer to here.
Okay, well, I thought I had a microphone. Isn't this a microphone?
It projects inside the room.
Okay. I'm going to sit down and take this off because otherwise we're going to get feedback, aren't we? All right. So, actually, this is much more comfortable. This will be stay here and sort of you can ask me questions about anything, your sex life. I'm the answer lady. I'll just sit here. Okay, so here's the deal. In this first book, which was the defense of innovism, I slowly discovered that defend it, innovism, from an ethical point of view. Well, you might say, well, that's easy. You can defend it on utilitarian grounds. That's not completely crazy, because after all, innovism has resulted in an increase in income per head of countries that have fully adopted it of 3,000% since 1800. Indeed, in the world as a whole, income per head has increased by 1,000% in real terms since 1800. This despite an enormous increase in population. If you think in Malthusian terms, which I advise you not to. So it's so that you could make a utilitarian argument. You could also make a Kantian argument, because after all, a market society, such as the one that's described by the word innovism, which was new in the sense that it was admired, deregulated, less controlled by the powers that be, is a system of treating each other as ends, not means. That is, obviously, if I make a voluntary deal with somebody, I'm not being coerced into it. I'm not a slave. I make a deal, and you sell me your nice hat, and I give you my speaker here, and we'll call that a deal. But the most fruitful way of defending innovism, or talking indeed about any political or economic system, is, I think, virtue ethics, is the ancient system of thinking of the good life or goodness in humans as analyzed in the Greek, cut up into separate, then further analyzable virtues. So courage in Aristotle's classic analysis is the virtue of the mean, the golden mean between foolhardiness, which isn't real courage. You're just stupid about your, say, a battlefield situation, or cowardice. It's in between, and that's courage. In fact, our I don't know where he is, because I can't recognize him with these damn masks on. There he is. He's done exactly this in this excellent book called The Authority of Virtue. And that it's become fashionable in philosophy is not why I adopted it, although it has become this virtue ethical approach. And here's an example of how to think about it. This is a diagram that I feature in these books, not all of them, some of them. It's got the 7 principal virtues of the Western tradition. In that, they're the merger of the 4 pagan virtues, or so-called cardinal virtues, for courage, justice, temperance, and prudence. The virtues of a successful polis, or, which amounts to the same thing, of a successful successful military camp, because that's what a Greek polis had to be. The so-called Christian virtues. It's kind of embarrassing to call them Christian because, you know, Christians are not famous for actually following these virtues, but so they're called, or they're also called theological virtues, which is not quite as strange. But anyway, faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. This jury-rigged sort of, I don't know what to call it, composite is seen in many other cultures in more or less the same terms. The coyote tales of the Plains Indians, Confucianism, South Asian epics, all admire most of these virtues, and in one way or another, virtually all of them. Certainly courage is obviously a universally admired virtue of humans. That is, courage is control of fear. If we're fearful and we're not able to control our fears, we're pusillanimous, we're oblomoph, we stay in bed. And hope is the virtue, you can think of it as a forward-looking virtue, the virtue of having a project, forward-looking. And faith is the backward-looking virtue of having an identity. If you're sort of Paris Hilton and have no identity, you just kind of go around being Paris Hilton and don't even know what that is. That's a failure as a human. Justice, the virtue of, in brief, giving people their due, and Tristan goes into that in great detail, what it means exactly to give people their due, to treat people temperance, like as justice is balance in the society, temperance is balance in the individual soul. It's the great virtue that Adam Smith praised in his first book of 2, Theory of Moral Sentiments. You know, he only wrote 2 books and no articles. This guy would not have an academic post. Adam Smith. He's a complete failure as a scholar in modern terms. Prudence. And prudence is the executive virtue, as St. Thomas Aquinas called it. It's know-how, it's knowing how to do things and actually doing them that way. How to drive, or knowing how to love, knowing how to have hope in an appropriate way. So it's the virtue that makes the other virtues work. And of course, it's the great virtue in economics. It's the central virtue, economists say, in economy. I call it Max U. Max U is a person, in German, Max U. Max U. Maximize utility subject to constraints. Another way of calling it is Samuelsonian economics, after my mother's longtime mixed doubles tennis partner, in case you needed that piece of it's true, but you know, it just shows that not all true things are important. So those are the virtues. And in this book, this first book on the list of my recent books, I go through these virtues and show that an innovistic economy, of the sort we actually have calls on these virtues for it to work correctly. Let's take the hardest case, love. What does love have to do with business? Come on, love, lovey-dovey. Men get very uncomfortable with that when you have love. Well, look, an office or a classroom, or to take an extreme case, a military unit does not work without love. Unit cohesion is what they call it in the army. And without unit cohesion, you can't save Private Ryan. You can't do the other things that a military unit is trying to do. In this case, a service of justice and courage. But without love, these units, families, most importantly, don't work. And that to sort of finish the connection, families are obviously, I hate to talk this way, but are obviously inputs into a successful economy. We're all kind of isolates. For example, if we just bore children and then let them wander around without a mother or father take care of them, we would have a very badly functioning economy, I can assure you. And so it goes, justice, treating people appropriately. Again, let's take the classroom example. The professor, the person in front of the class, is supposed to be saying something that's both interesting and important and true. I guess all three of them simultaneously. And she, it's her social role, and it's just for the to treat her with the respect that's due a teacher in all cultures. And that's just, that's not, let's not get too extreme about it. They don't have to worship the teacher, but they can't be reading the newspaper in the front row. Actually, a friend of mine had a student when I was at the University of Chicago. He had a student, undergraduate student, who literally sat in the front row and drank Southern Comfort for his lectures. Every time the kid would come with a bottle of Southern Comfort and empty it by the end of the class. It's quite strange, but I guess in his view that was okay. So I'm tempted always to say capitalist because that's the word we use, but it's such a stupid word that I'm determined to get it out of my vocabulary. And innovistic economy depends on virtues. Now that's true of a flourishing polity. It's true of a good society more generally. It depends on virtues. The Latin is hangs from. That's what the word depend means. That's the physical metaphor in the Latin word from which we get the word depend. So here's the deal. Let me just fit this part of it. I've arranged these in a space. They're not just randomly. The top is the transcendent. Well, let's go the other way. Let's start with the virtues of self-control and prudence, whose main ethical object is the self. It's not true that ethics is only about how you treat other people. That's false. To put it in kind of theological terms, we're all God. Sorry if you're an atheist, and I apologize for offending you, but we're all God's creatures, And as God's creatures, we owe the cultivation of ourselves. We owe it to ourselves to learn to play the cello, right? We owe it to ourselves to not walk into the traffic. We owe it to ourselves to be prudent and balanced in our souls, to temperate. And there's the object of ethical behavior, namely justice, courage, especially on behalf of others, courage in battle, the courage of the mother who gets up every morning to take care of her severely handicapped son. It's courage worthy of the Medal of Honor. I said it's one of the big faults, I think, of ethical philosophy, is often practiced, that it stops at the others and doesn't deal with the two other objects of ethical behavior, because there's also the transcendent. The great Anglican theologian Hooker, late 16th century, says, man does seek a triple perfection, namely physical, intellectual, and these two satisfied, there's still a third. And that third, theologically speaking, is God. But you can give completely secular versions of this. Baseball, remember Field of Dreams, baseball, or art, with a capital A. All of us are devoted to science or scholarship with a capital S. Answer. The transcendent answers the question, so what? Dutch and new and now. If you don't have that, you're obviously in trouble, both as a person and as a society. So there's an up and down in this diagram, and there's also a left and a right. Left, the socialist side, are the virtues of connection. And of course, these are primary virtues, and I won't go into the detail. It's a 500-page book. I won't go into the details of why they're primary. St. Thomas has the best exposition of this, I think. Why they're primary and how they relate to the hundreds of other virtues and vices, which would be the absence of these or their contradiction, that you can think of kind of populating the interstices of this diagram. So entrepreneurship, the great innovistic virtue, is a combination of hope, courage, and prudence. It takes those elements and makes a molecule called entrepreneurship. But as I said, there's a left and a right. The virtues of connection, the virtues of autonomy. The great theologian Paul Tillich called these the right one, the autonomy male, you might call it, the liberal side of this, the courage to be. He was an existentialist, one of the things. And whereas this other side he called the courage to be a part of. You mean Constant would call the left side ancient liberty, which means the courage to, not courage, to the right to be a member of the phalanx and the right side would be modern liberty in his terms. So the rest of the book, the other things in the book, are all about showing that this works for a commercial society. There are versions of all these virtues. I'm often interpreted as being in favor of bourgeois virtue, and then they wonder what that is. And they think, gee, she must mean there's some separate kind of virtue called bourgeois. And that's not my point. My point is that the ancient and rather obvious philosophical psychology that I'm portraying here applies to business too, applies to your life in your labor market, applies to your life as a consumer, applies to the other aspects of the economy. In all of them, now observe, this psychology is more complicated than Max Yu. Max Yu, I also call prudence only. And I yield to no one in my enthusiasm for prudence only arguments in economics. I've written entire books in favor of it. We're working on a book now which revives some old work I did on English open fields and enclosures, agricultural history. And back then, back in the 70s and 80s, when I was first working on it, I wanted to make it a book, I didn't do it, called The Prudent Peasants, the Prudent Peasant. Now I want to call it The Prudent and Faithful Peasant, because I've gotten beyond the economist's little tool or hammer, you could call it, which he, and I choose the gender carefully, wishes to apply to everything because everything's a nail if you have gotten a hammer. So that's my claim. So my claim is that business people usually are seriously virtuous. Just did a debate in Prospect magazine, a magazine of opinion in Britain, with someone, a little short debate, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, on the proposition by some guy, some journalist who's also a socialist. The proposition is, should we despise billionaires? And he said, yes, damn it, we should despise them, they're terrible. And I said, no, they're not. They're as said, all systems can have corruption. Bad people, good people populate Russia as much as the United States in every period. So the point is that goodness can be and commonly is evinced in a commercial society. And I think we've got to get over this deep conviction we have that God and Mammon, Mammon is just the Aramaic word for money. God and Mammon, you cannot serve two masters, God and Mammon. I don't think that's what it says in the Bible, in the Christian New Testament, and that's what Jesus is supposed to have said. But it's not true. You can very easy to get out of this theologically by claiming, which I think is true, that what Jesus of Nazareth meant is that if you're only devoted to Mammon, you then will wreck your service of God. And I mention him again, a perfect example of this is Donald Trump, I like to say, we Anglicans think that hell happens in your lifetime. We don't think so much of this idea that you get pie in the sky or bad stuff in hell, but we think that you're in a personal hell, as poor Donald Trump is, because he substitutes money for everything. So I'm not sure I made this point. Now, connection between this point, this ethical point I make, and my defense of a commercial society and saying it's not so bad, let's not get carried away in our attacks on it. There are things to criticize about it, but it's buying low and selling high is not evil, and so on and so forth. All the things that and economist things, and this more particularly scientific point, although that's a scientific thing too, but the scientific point about the sources of modern economic growth is this. Is the steam power, if you wish, the spring, the source of both the modern success of the economy, its innovism, and is the source, or the substance, you might say, of the virtues it might have. What's that? I just wrote a paper for a Dutch theological journal on connecting free markets and freedom of the will, right? And it's somewhat more nuanced than that, but that's the basic idea. My claim is that liberalism, which you can define, although I like very much Alan's parsing this, and I may have to, I will have to think more about it. But is the theory that the economy, the society, the polity should have no slaves. Schmitz, the superb social philosopher at Arizona, says that it's the right to say no. That's right, it's the right to say no. In no other political philosophy leading to an economic policies, a free economy, in no other political philosophies, or to express it more positively, in all other political philosophies, there are slaves. Slaves to a husband, slaves to a master, slaves to an aristocracy, slaves to a state, to state bureaucrats, or the powers that be. So it's, and my claim is, and I've got to develop this claim more, it's very helpful to be forced to talk about it. That's the advantage of being a teacher, that you're allowed to talk about your ideas to compulsory audiences, slavery, and having to do that forces the ideas into existence. But all right. A liberal society, I would claim, is one that encourages, notice the etymology there, the virtues. And that it causes the flourishing of human beings because it treats them as adults. That's the other way, talking about in one sentence what liberalism is. It's adultism. It's the theory, you could say, or the proposition that we should treat everyone as an adult who is an adult. Now, we don't treat children. If your 3-year-old son proposes to rush into the traffic, you just grab him. You use coercion to stop him from doing it. Yeah, I get it. You should. But when we're adults, the theory of liberalism is that you should be treated as an adult. That does not mean that you need to go to social Darwinism. You do not have to go to Ayn Rand, the kind of screw you theory of autonomy, that I don't care, I get to do whatever I want. It's ridiculous discussion that's going on in the United States now, where some of my less thoughtful libertarian fellow libertarians, I admit to it, say, I'm not sure the professors say this, but the ordinary people do. It's my right to not wear a mask. What's this mask stuff? I'm a free person. Well, you're not allowed. I'm allowed to move my arm around like this. Actually, I've got a pain in my arm. It kind of helps it. But if I get close to you and hit you in the nose, that's where my right to move my arm like this stops. My right to blow is up your nose stops at your nose. If I die of COVID because I've been careless, that's okay, feel free. But it stops at your nose. So it's not about freedom. So anyway, that's the case. That's the case in brief, that liberalism is good for us. The historical question here, why it was so new in the 18th century, and it was. There are tiny little fragments of it before. Contractarianism, Hobbes, and all that, because and then you've got the wonderful statement by Richard Rumbold on his hanging in 1685. He had been a soldier in the English Civil War on the parliamentary side, and he was a leveler, which was the term of contempt that Charles I assigned to his enemies. People who wanted everyone to be equal. Said, I think there is no man, he used man, of course, I think there is no man born, I'm going to screw it up slightly, fated of God to rule another. Now I'll be correct. For none comes into the world with a saddle on his back, spurred to ride him. Those were just straws in the wind. Then in Blessed Adam Smith and Mary Wollstonecraft, Tom Paine in a more radical way, and David Thoreau, which is often forgotten that he was a great liberal in the early 19th century sense, and above all, John Stuart Mill articulated this vision, say, and Constant, France. So that's my tied up package. This way I've been talking explains all these books. As I say, I forgot. Shows them all to be of a piece, I think. I'm very old. I think towards the end of your academic career, you ought to try to figure out, well, so what, dear? What is it kind of what is it about? And that's what it's about. A liberal society is not just a rich society, it's a virtuous society. Thank you very much. So let's have some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Deirdre. That was both informative and inspiring. And the way we're going to deal with the questions now is I will more or less alternate between questions from our live audience here and questions from what was once called out there in TV land, but that's of course very old-fashioned German, out there in the ether.
Ellen, why don't you take off your mask because you're more than 6 feet away?
That's true. I could be.
It'll make it more lucid.
More ways than one. But in any case, I will begin with questions from people here in the room and then go back and forth. I have some questions that have already arrived from the internet, and from those of you who have just listened to this online, please feel free to also type in your questions in the manner that Dan suggested earlier. So, yes.
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. As someone who's an expert in history, religion, and economics, I think you're maybe uniquely positioned to answer the question of what do you think of Joe Henrich's thesis that liberalism was seeded indirectly by the early Christian church's ban on things like cousin marriage that broke down extensive kinship and forced people to have voluntary associations?
We seem to have a penchant for these cute materialist theories, and I don't think much of it. But I'm not. I speak largely from ignorance. I haven't read the book. I'd rather not be dogmatic about it. But a similar theory that's somewhat less materialistic, but still has more or less the same fault, is Seidendorf, is that his name?
Larry Seidendorf.
Larry Seidendorf's claim that liberalism comes from Christianity. And yeah, equality of souls, say, let's just take that as part of it. Also, no man comes into the world with a saddle on his back. Okay, I get it. But that's true of lots of other religions. It's true of, certainly true of both Islam and Judaism, completely unsurprising. But it's also true of Buddhism, and so on. And the timing is appallingly bad. Christianity happened a long time ago, you may have noticed. And yet this didn't really get going until 1800. Some people say, oh, that's a great virtue, because that makes it deep in European history. But one of my themes is that it was an accident that the Europeans got there first. It wasn't some deep virtue of melanin challenged humans. People want to believe, I'm accusing them of racism or something, but they really want, well, the Western civilization. I was raised on Bristol, which was, when I was a kid, it was first published in 1915. He was a specialist on Babylonia or something like that. And it was an account of how Western civilization includes the Middle East, which is a little strange. Yet if you don't do it, then you can, and agriculture was supposed to have been invented in the Middle East. That's false. It was invented in 9 different parts of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa. It was invented in Peru, Central America. So I get really unhappy with these deep theories that conveniently line up with certain conservative opinions. But maybe I'm wrong. Yes, over there.
I just wanted to, just before we get to you, I'll let you take one of the.
Yeah, do
internet
please,
questions.
an alternate.
Uh,
And I'll try to be briefer because, you know, you press the button and you get a 500-page book. So be careful. We'll lock the doors. We'll bring sandwiches in.
So this is, in fact, that your answer a little bit implied by your mention of Ayn Rand earlier. But how would you respond to advocates of capitalism that suggest that selfishness is a virtue and that capitalism is based on selfishness?
Well, it's of course Mandeville's proposition. Bernard Mandeville, a Dutch doctor. It's a somewhat unusual person. He comes from Holland. He's a doctor. He lives in England and writes in English eloquently about his wonderful discovery that public virtues result from private vices. Result from, he said, you got to be viceful in order to get a functioning economy. And it's a theme that you hear over and over again and is accepted very frequently by critics of a commercial economy. You know, people will say, oh yeah, we got to keep consuming like mad to keep the bubble, the balloon of the commercial economy going. And if we all were abstemious and got bag wine from the co-op and bought onion paper, Greek testaments, and studied them all the time, the economy would collapse, which is ridiculous. So what's my rant here? So that vision is wrong and is not, it's kind of the opposite of what I'm saying. For the economy to work well, people need to be good. Just as for politics to work well, they have to be good. And it also says, and I want to get clear in my own mind on this, that institutions have to be helpful for improving people, making them more virtuous. So there's a kind of interaction. Her hand was up, really.
Oh, thank you. So it sounds like you sort of thought that perhaps the time and place where liberalism happened to originate was somewhat.
Could you take off your mask so I can hear you better?
Oh, sure.
Just for a moment.
Sure. So it sounds like you think that the time and place when liberalism really originated was somewhat coincidental.
Yeah.
Do you think it's also a coincidence that there are like increasing threats to liberalism for both the left and the right now, or do you think there's something about our present moment that makes those ideologies attractive and makes people see?
That's a deep question. Now you can put your mask back on. Yeah, I'm part of the reason I wrote these books, although the early ones were before the rise of this crazy left and right, although this kind of populism, I don't need to tell you, has existed in various forms for a long time. But I don't know. Yes, I actually come to think of it, now that you asked the question, I think it is a matter of accidents. If Trump had not won, Bolsonaro wouldn't have arisen. Wouldn't have been emboldened.
But that came before Trump.
Yeah, it came before Trump, though.
Yeah.
And I think the analysis that some people make, and I'm not competent to criticize it, I think it's probably plausible, that the kind of arrogance of expertise of the class of what I call the clerisy, which is everyone in this room, is part of the problem here. I was having a discussion with a colleague here about this, and we agreed that what were the numbers? There are no members of the United States Senate who don't have a bachelor's degree. And there are 3 or 4 members of the United States Congress who don't. Yet 2/3 of the population doesn't have a bachelor's degree, adult population. What? So I'm not the right person to ask about the sources of this, but you can see that I'm worried about it.
Right, yeah.
And I'm preaching against it all the time, against the populism.
I'll switch back to our internet questions for a moment. So how does ethical capitalism incorporate the Beatitudes, especially both versions in Matthew and Luke?
Well, I've actually written of this. I was writing on it just the other day. Until about a century ago, clerics, more in a restricted sense, Christian officials, did not have a systematic disdain for a commercial society. I think in the last century or so, they've developed it. Completely unsurprisingly, because the rest of the society was developing a socialist ethic. I analyze it as applying family logic, the logic of small groups of friends or a family, to the society as a whole. Since we all grow up in families, and hope for all of you it was a loving family. If we're not on a farm or in a small business where we, as children, can see what's going on and can see our mom and pop down in the store, below the apartment, above the store, how they work and what we think that the family model can be applied to the whole economy. So it's not surprising theologians have also gone along with this. Christians call the New Testament, and in particular the Gospels, and in particular the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are a mixed bag so far as which virtues they emphasize. If you do analysis of the parallel Gospels, whereas as the question points out, there are two versions of blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, and blah, blah, blah. You find that this man, Jesus, and he was truly a man, also, not only, but truly, emphasizes various parts of this at different times and talks often of prudence. Of course, he's always pointing up. He's always pointing to his Father God. I get it. But to say that the Sermon on the Mount is kind of the be all and end all for society is not, I think, a sound inference, so to speak. I'll have a lot more to say about this in this book I'm working on, God. Let's see, God and Mammon. Not to solve it, but I'll wander.
Yes.
Actually, I'd like to follow up on that. The question on your thoughts on usage. I mean, one of the things that brings the two sides of the West together, Athens and Jerusalem, is what looks to be an accidental antipathy towards usury. You see this in Aristotle.
Yeah, you do.
You also see it in biblical texts.
You do?
Testament.
You do?
It's not that they are, morally confident.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily dispute.
Yeah.
But they you know, there is a tradition of clerical antipathy towards usury commerce.
Yeah.
As something that is inherently destabilizing.
Yeah.
Certainly at the moral level.
Yeah.
You know, what do you make of this?
Well,
A mistake that they made about
yeah.
set up the right
Well,
information in politics and commerce?
It's certainly a mistake. But that from the economic point of view. There was a book about 10 years ago called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by an anthropologist. That's right. He just died last year. And it's a silly damn book. Because how are you going to get loans if you don't compensate the borrower? We could, you know, everyone in this room would like their debts forgiven today. I would, of course, and you know, I'm more on the case. No, let's not get into it. But we'd all like, but then if you made it a law, then you wouldn't get any loans made. So that would be terrible for poor people. It's rather similar to the argument against rent control, which results in low rents for a while for some people, but results in terrible housing for new people, say. And the same thing, of course, can be said about usury, that if you restrict the interest rate, then the people who are willing to pay it, you know, willing to pay extortionate, you might say, interest rates. Look, we have 18% on credit cards. For God's sakes, everyone in this room, pay your credit bills every month. Don't do it. This is practical economics. But you're making a subtle point here. That yes, Aristotle was against trade and regarded as inferior. Aristotle, the tutor of aristocrats. But Athenians didn't. Athens was a great commercial empire. And you can bet that they were borrowing and lending like mad to get the grain crop, the oil crop, the wine crop traded across the Eastern Mediterranean. Same thing holds for the ancient Near East, which is unusually cordial to commerce in many of its aspects, let's say. But you're perfectly right. In both the Hebrew Bible and the so-called New Testament, there's kind of railing against Mammon. And, you know, all the stories in the Hebrew Bible about how you remember they're endless stories and Proverbs and everything about how it's unjust to lean on the poor and so forth. It's mixed, I suppose, is my answer. And I don't think there is anything particularly mysterious that clerics, whether defined in church terms or in broader terms, are against money. I mean, this crazy argument that Socrates is supposed to have made, that if you're paid as a teacher, you're corrupt. That's Plato and Socrates. And Aristotle, I guess, too. Although he was paid, so I don't know quite what his view on this is. So I don't know. I guess I just have to end with the mixed point and to point out that in the Middle Ages, which is where people are eloquent against usury, they pay it. Florence and Venice, Prada didn't hesitate for a moment to pay interest in various tricky ways.
I'll revert to the internet one more time here. How is the great enrichment and innovism being taught in schools?
badly, I have to say, but that applies to lots of things. There's a politics here, obviously. You can tell the story of the United States as a comedy, as we say in the English department, as something that ends happily in dramas with them, in romantic dramas with a marriage, of course. Or you can, and that's the conservative line that you hear a lot about these days, especially when people are railing against the what's it called, the race, what's it called?
Critical race theory.
Yeah, critical race theory, which, by the way, I think is very good economic history. They kind of ignore the, but anyway, let's not get into that. And then you can treat it as a tragedy that, my God, we still have racism and poor people in the United States, some poor people, and isn't that terrible? And that's the kind of choice and that a school teacher has to make, which way to do it. As a teacher of Western civilization, it's actually called that when I taught it for the history department at the University of Iowa to 430 kids. That's because 430 because that's how much the chemistry lecture room could hold, the biggest one on campus. I told them this. I said, look, you can look at the arc of human history, not human European history since 1648, which was when it split. And I did the second half as a tragedy ending in the Holocaust. Or you can treat it as a comedy ending in the great enrichment, the enrichment of ordinary people. The ancestors of everyone in this room earned $2 or $3 a day in Boulder prices. You couldn't even buy a cappuccino for $3 a day in Boulder, I take it. Be much more expensive. So we were extremely poor. And now we're rich. So that's a good thing. So I don't know. It's actually the short answer to the question is I don't know how it's being taught. Except that as a professor of history, I know that history is something we tell ourselves. I know that it's a novel or a play or an epic, and that it's shaped by our narrative sense, what Schumpeter called pre-analytic visions that we bring to the job of being a historian. And you can go either way, with or without an explicit political purpose.
Time for one more question.
I want to come back to this issue of enslavement because
Yeah.
I think if going back to Aristotle and Jesus, sort of their concerns about wealth. I mean, I think one of the great things about market societies, I think the thing you pointed out, is the way that they help to reduce poverty more than anything else has.
Absolutely.
One of
Like
the
gigantic.
great gifts of market societies, right?
You bet.
But I think there is also this concern about sort of the unlimited, right? I mean, that's sort of my concerns about sort of what I call the limiting virtues, and one of those is contentment. And I think this ancient conception of freedom is a kind of positive freedom, that we're free when we're virtuous. So, for instance, Aristotle, when he contrasts the art of household management with the art of acquisition, he says those who just want to make more money, they're serious about living, but they're not serious about living well. And I think that's part of, when Jesus says you can't serve both God and Mammon, I think Aristotle would also been against serving Mammon. Mammon should serve the good life. And the good life is something self-sufficient. And so there is, I think, this concern that that maybe markets, or sort of however we want to recall the term, it's sort of, it's unlimited in a way.
Yeah,
But
but
we can become enslaved to
I understand that.
status and
That's
wealth.
that-
So I wonder what you think about
Well,
this sort of ancient view of freedom, I think that.
again, we can mention Donald Trump as a slave to unlimited accumulation. That's something that Aristotle says very plainly, and it echoes down through Western civilization. It's a trope. I forget what the Greek is, but it's a trope that it's unlimited, and that's unnatural. Whereas agriculture is limited, says he, and that makes it okay. But commerce is unlimited. Buy low, sell high, and keep doing it. And it's not a very sensible economic model that he's got in mind, but keep doing it, and you get more and more money, and get blah blah blah. And it's kind of a cleric's view of what the problem is. I don't think that most people in business are like that. Let's start with that. And you're right that if they do, then they're missing the virtue of, well, I could call it temperance. They get crazy about making money and just keep, but on the other hand, should we detest billionaires, to go back to the Prospect article, which came out yesterday? Not if we want the signals to be correct in the economy. Look, what's his first name? The soccer player, Messi. What's his first?
Lionel
Lionel Messi. The inventor of the Messi turn, as I understand it. Whatever the hell that is. He's making a fantastic amount of money. That he does signals to the world we need more of that. And if we insisted, no, we're going to pay Messi the same amount as everyone else. In fact, that's how baseball was organized until the end of the reserve clause of free agency. There's a wonderful story about Babe Ruth. 1930, the country was sliding into the Great Depression. Hoover was frantic. He didn't know what to do. And he had principles, so he often didn't do what he could have done. Babe Ruth was asked, aren't you ashamed that this year you've made more than the President of the United States? His reply was, I've had a better year. If you've had a better year, it signals something that's worth that we must let happen. We can tax inheritance. I have no trouble with that, and land. I have no trouble with that. But so far as entrepreneurial gains, we got to let it happen. It dissipates. 98% of the social gain from inventions since the Second World War, says Bill Nordhaus, goes to the consumers. 2% goes to the Walton family. So they're unspeakably rich, but it's only from 2%. So innovism is good and good for you, dears. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This worked out very well. It's sitting here and doing that.
And on that note of a Ruthian great arcing home run, we'll close the evening, and I'll invite those of you who are present to step outside in the corridor where we have a little bit of a reception to offer everybody. So thank you very much for coming.